Hey everyone, it's Joe Kral with the Society of St. Sebastian, and again, welcome to Pro-Life University. This week we're going to begin coverage of what we would call anti-coercion legislation, specifically with regards to abortion. And actually over the next few weeks we're going to cover different parts of this. I don't want to make the video too long because otherwise it's just be too long and no one's going to want to sit through, a really long lecture with that. So I'm going to try to keep it down to about 5 or 6 minutes here, and then we'll go to the next video and so forth. But this week I kind of want to give you a little bit of a background as to why pro-life organizations are pushing for anti-coercion legislation. And it's really important here. One of the things that we fundamentally need to understand, just a couple things to posit here, is one, and I'm sure you've heard me, if you've watched any of my videos or all my videos, you've heard me say this before. And I mentioned it in my last week's video as well. And that is that roughly 64% of women who go in to get an abortion feel pressured into having an abortion. So we're talking about nearly 2/3 of women who go in to have an abortion are experiencing some level of coercion with respect to them getting that abortion. Right? That is a staggering number. That really kind of tells us something here, that many of these women do not feel that they really have a choice in the matter. All right? So that's an important point here as well to keep in all of our considerations here. But there's another important point to understand as well, that when we look at the numbers of those who favor abortion, and we divide the categories into men and into women, and the simple fact is that typically the vast majority of polls that are done on this particular point shows that men definitely favor abortion more so than women do. So that kind of gives us a mindset here, and especially when we dive into the history of this particular subject. One of the things that we fundamentally need to understand when it comes to this particular issue is that when it comes to the subject of abortion, coercion is always somewhere in the mix. In fact, if we look at the history of abortion, and we got to understand, abortion just didn't become legal within the 20th century. We've seen elements of abortion throughout pretty much the history of mankind. We know that the ancient Greeks wrote about it, the ancient Romans wrote about it. In fact, we see philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle talk about it. And even Paul kind of alludes to it in his letter to the Galatians, specifically chapter 5:20, and we'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. But the simple fact is that when it comes to this particular phenomenon, is we typically see men coercing women into having an abortion. This was true in the ancient times, especially with the Romans and the Greeks. Women were pressured into having abortion. We got to understand, in those day and ages, women weren't necessarily viewed as equals to men, and so men dominated them in this particular thing. If they didn't want the responsibility of having a child, they had to get an abortion, and they would feel pressured to get an abortion. And certainly what that meant for them, just from various points of view, if they could stay within the family, if they were going to get kicked out and so forth. There were all sorts of things that were going on with respect to this particular issue. And so we fundamentally need to understand that when it comes to a culture of death, if you will, coercion is something that follows closely behind it, because coercion is taking the easy way out, if you will. It's denying the responsibility of what's going on. So we know, historically speaking, when it comes to this particular issue, women were typically coerced into having an abortion or even giving up their child for infanticide. Right? It was a very well-known practice. And in fact, historically speaking, again, when we look at the early Christians, it was really the early Christians in many ways who were adopting these children that were left on the hillside, if you can imagine, all right? Because literally how infanticide was practiced in that day and age is someone literally, left the child on the hillside for the animals to eat. And so Christians would come across these children and adopt these children. It's one of the reasons why Christianity was gaining so much success and is gaining in numbers, if you will. It's because they were taking in these children and adopting them and raising them as Christians. And so we certainly see this early practice of sorts. Right? And we certainly see early condemnations of abortion. So, for example, you heard me mention this idea of Paul writing in Galatians, specifically chapter 5, verse 20. He gets into this idea of what he says in most modern translations. For example, in that verse, you'll see the word for sorcery or magic. But the actual Greek word was pharmakeia, and it's a word that talks about potions or drugs, right? And so you got to remember, a lot of people who would have gone to, these witches or so forth, were seen as sorcerers, if you will, because they concocted potions. And part of those potions, or some of those potions, were abortifacient sort of potions that would cause a woman to abort her unborn child. And so we see Paul here explicitly, in some ways, saying that abortion is wrong. You're not supposed to associate with this sort of thing. So we know abortion existed back in these times. We know there are massive coercive practices in these times. And we know today that there's still coercive practices. We can look at various modern, very well-known examples. Ray Caruth, for example, was trying to pressure his girlfriend back in 2001 to get an abortion. She refused, and he ended up killing her. There's another recent case, or not too recent, probably about 6 or so years ago, where a NFL running back by the name of Arian Foster was pressuring his girlfriend to having an abortion. She ended up wanting to keep the child. And so, we have all these cases that come up time and time again where women are facing this particular issue. And so we got to understand coercion is a very real practice, right, that happens. And there's a reason why pro-life forces are out there trying to fight it. Now, I'm going to stop here because I think we're getting a little bit too long. I'm going to get into some more of the aspects of it next week. We'll call it part 2, if you will. And again, I hope you all have a good weekend. God bless. Take care. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to write them down below. And give us a big thumbs up. We always appreciate that. Thank you and God bless.